I think it's also a reflection of the changing role of the CIO. And not all CIOs, I think, have made this transition, right? That historically CIOs were very focused on sort of the operational and delivery capabilities. And while clearly that is not only still critical, and I would argue getting every day more complex with the complexity of the tech stack, the CIO has to be operating strategically, has to be looking at this very, very broad perspective, including, the sort of the geopolitical aspects of, forget the security side or the geopolitical risk side, but just where are people making investments? And so there was some interesting news also coming out of Paris about yet another 9-digit seed round for an AI company. And so I guess some people are starting to call Paris the Silicon Valley of Europe. Although, I mean, how many Silicon Valleys of X do we really need? But I thought it was interesting. You raised this up about like, hey, is this a thing? I have some opinions, but I'm curious about yours first as to what you think this represents, if anything.
Yeah. So this Poolside just raised another equivalent of $400 million to support coding-based LLMs. We are definitely seeing how large language models are supporting code because we have this structured language that can be quickly optimized. And there's only so many different ways to be able to show functional code that end up going into these models. So these models end up being very good at providing recommendations for basic code. Obviously not for writing entire applications because the attention span of these models starts dissipating after 50, 100, 200 lines. But for little segments and bits and pieces that people are trying to write, these models can be quite helpful. So now we've got another player in this space, Poolside, which is specifically looking at how to accelerate developer productivity, which is going to end up being one of the big use cases for LLMs. So it's interesting to see that Paris now has 3 big companies in the LLM space between Poolside and H and Mistral that are all dedicated to competing in AI to go along with what we have here in the US.
I think it's interesting. I mean, Poolside aside, I think Poolside has an interesting model. They are ostensibly a foundational or a frontier model, but they are very specifically focused on this idea of copilots for developers. I think that's a smart move. I think that so from that perspective, I think we're going to see more and more and more of this, right? I've been a huge proponent of the fact that we have enough frontier models. That's not going to be, you're trying to compete. A, you need to have monster funding, and B, it's already saturated. We're going to see consolidation. I think the future, the next round, and we've talked about this before, AI apps, of taking this to the next level of actually applied AI, and how do I start solving specific business problems and use cases with it. I think this is an example of that. It's still extremely broad, which is why I think you're seeing this level of funding, but it's interesting. I think speaking specifically about the Paris part of this, I think we're going to see this sort of continuing fight of organizations, of rather not organizations, of countries, and even more than countries, like in the US, cities, recognizing that they need to sort of fight for relevance and to try to become that sort of center of gravity. I was just in Bangalore last week. Bangalore is the Silicon Valley of India, right?
Yeah.
It's not where the big companies are based, it's where the small companies and the startups. And what I think you see with all of this is, despite our remote work world that we now live in, is that there's still something to be said, even if people are working from home, of having this sort of concentration of talent in one place and having that ability to sort of feed off of one another's ideas and people jumping around between companies and sort of cross-pollinating. And, I've talked about the oh my gosh, I just forgot their name. I just lost the name. Anyway, in Florence, Italy, back at the Renaissance, it was the, what is the name of the family?
The Medicis?
Thank you. The Medici effect. It was this book about how the Medicis brought together all these artists, and it just created this cross-pollination. And that's what we see over and over and over again. And so I think in part it's a city or a country saying, we want to attract this investment. And then once that happens, it just starts feeding on itself.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see more of it. And I think it's valid and important. And I think going all the way back to the geopolitical concerns, I think countries are recognizing this is a huge part of the future and they need to have a play in it. So,
yeah, just kind of from a interest perspective, I find it interesting that although Germany obviously has its share of enterprise software professionals from SAP, all of this is centrally focused in France, where business objects started once upon a time, and they have the strong analytics capability, but probably not the same border issues as Germany. Everybody in Europe cares about data privacy, obviously, but Germany's restrictions on data are probably preventing it from being a center for AI in the same way that France is being right now. And I'll be honest, I don't know the exact rules for it, but it is interesting to see that so much of this is happening specifically in France and not in the rest of Western Europe.
well, a little sidebar on that. So this will segue to our last conversation, but a little sidebar on that. So New York is seeing this, where I live, is seeing this interesting resurgence, specifically in AI startups.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't very long ago that everyone was sort of writing New York off because it was so expensive and all of that. But I've just read this quote. I don't remember who it was from, but it was one of these startup CEOs that said the reality is that the best engineers in the world want to live in a place like this, and we're paying them enough they can live here. And I actually suspect that Paris is probably the same. I mean, Paris is my second favorite city in the world. There's a lot of people that love Paris, and so it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of the same idea. And so I think it's going to be this sort of interesting dynamic that it's going to be this, if to attract the talent, you need to have a city that people want to live in. You need to be a place that people want to be. And I think it's going to be this interesting sort of evolution, despite all this talk about remote work and how we don't want the return to office and all this stuff. I think there's still the sense that people want to live in certain places, and if you can go to where those people are, then you're going to get the talent you need to build your business. But
Right.